I was walking home last week from my girlfriend Alexa's house and took a shortcut through a wooded area instead of walking around. I did this every time as it was about a half-an-hour walk when I cut through the woods, and it did trim around 15 minutes off my journey home, even if it probably wasn't the safest way to go. I kept walking past a worn-down barn with these big steel double doors and boarded up windows. Every time I walked past it, I wanted to go inside more and more. I wanted to take Alexis there. I'd been dating Alexis for almost 3 months, so I figured if I had asked her, she would want to come with me. It wouldn't make her think I was weird or something, since she knew most things about me already. I hoped she'd think it was a fun idea, and I was right. She agreed to go with me, and we arranged to meet near her house the next day, and we'd go from there. We met the next day and made our way to the barn. She looked very worried about what lay beyond those doors. I prayed they were unlocked, and you could imagine my joy when I found out they were. I pulled one of the doors open slowly and looked around before gesturing to Alexis to follow me in. Looking around, it was emptier than I'd assumed it would be. There was barely anything towards the front of the barn, and as we walked further in there was a small metal table with wheels, which had tools on it, such as screwdrivers, drills, nails, etc. There was a tall cupboard in the corner of the barn, and Alexis grabbed my hand tightly and pointed to a chair with a video camera pointed at it, and a table with a laptop plugged into the camera. It was set out like someone was expecting us. We headed over towards the video camera, and there was an SD card on the table next to it. I read the label on the SD card, and it just read maniac.avi. I put it into the laptop, and the file popped up. There was 8 video files on there, which were dated and simply named Blonde.Avi, Blonde/Final.Avi, Blonde2.Avi, Blonde2Final.Avi, and so on. The most recent file was dated March 12th, 2017, and was named Blonde4.Avi. I waited for it to load and hit play. A girl sat on the chair. Her arms were tied together at the front, and they were resting on her lap. She had dirty blonde hair, she was skinny, and she looked as though under the blue and purple bruising on her face that she was pretty. She was somewhat limp, and she was crying, but she all of a sudden gained the strength and fought hard to free herself, while looking towards the other side of the room and crying more, almost as if someone was coming.
Help!
A guy came on the screen. His face was covered by a mask, but his long beard protruded out of the bottom of it, and he was wearing all black. The camera zoomed into him holding a sign saying, "Good evening, watchers. Welcome. Thank you for coming to see us. I'm your host, Mr. Maniac. Sit back and enjoy. Send requests." He dropped the sign on the floor and walked to stand behind the girl, leaning over her, lifting up the bottom of his mask and running his tongue up her neck.
Get away from me!
The girl cringed and cried, squirming to get away from him, but he grabbed her shoulders and slammed her back against the chair. Her resistance seemed to anger him, and he slapped her without hesitation, and she fell to the floor.
Get away from me!
He then picked her up by one hand and threw her back in the chair, pulling her head back by her hair and looking into her eyes.
No!
He walked away and returned wheeling a metal table and pulled it into the frame. There were tools on the table like cordless drills, knives, and screwdrivers. He picked up a knife and cut into the girl's arm. and without a second thought, put the knife to his mouth and proceeded to lick the blood off of it. She watched as he slid his tongue up and down the blade, cringing and looking away. He put the knife down to his side, closed his eyes, and let out what sounded like a moan of pleasure, licking his lips and slightly biting them too. The girl cried and spoke to her tormentor, asking him to let her go.
I'm begging you.
She was crying hysterically and raising her arms as well as she could, clasping her hands together and shaking them back and forth and pleading with him. He silenced her with a simple finger to the mouth. The camera zoomed into the girl's face, then onto the table full of tools. It stayed there for a brief moment until Mr. Maniac picked up a power drill with his dirty hand, and the camera followed it up until it reached the head of the girl. He placed the tip of the drill on the temple of the girl, looked past the camera to the cameraman and nodded. He pushed the drill in a little and watched the girl squirm and try to pull her head away. He smiled wildly and grabbed her by the hair, holding her head in place. He switched on the drill, and the sound rang through the barn, combined with her screams. He dug it in further and further into her temple, and she began to shake violently. Mr. Maniac was laughing by this point, an over-enthusiastic kind of laugh. The girl stopped shaking and slumped into herself. It was over for her. Mr. Maniac raised one leg and put it on the chair she sat in and pushed it out of view of the camera. He raised a hand to the camera as if to give some credit to the cameraman, and then stood proudly for a second before he raised his hand again and took a bow. He repeated this twice more, went off screen for a second, and returned with another sign. Until next time. I sifted through 3 or 4 more files. All of the girls starring in these films looked very similar. They were all blonde, skinny, etc. I looked over at Alexis, who was looking at me in terror. "What do we do?" she asked shakingly. Her blonde hair fell in front of her eye, hiding her tears. "Nothing," I replied. "It's not our problem." "But Mark, it's wrong. We can't just—" "Lex," I cut her off. "I don't want you to do anything about it. I don't think you should either." Alexis took a few minutes to calm down and walked towards the door. "I want to get out of here," she cried and began twisting the handle and pushing the door forcefully. Babe, the door won't open." She turned to face me in a panic. I quickly walked over to the door and started pushing on it. It was locked tight. There was no way we were getting out through that door. "Stand back," I said as I pushed her back and tried to break down the door with my shoulder, but there was no way I could. I turned around and stood with my back against the door. We were locked in. Alexis started to panic even more and started pacing and rambling on and on to herself. She looked as if she was going to lose her mind. I stood and watched as she grew more and more frantic, her steps getting faster and her face getting more and more wet with tears. I couldn't console her. She was way past the point of that anyway. She was hysterical at this point. My girlfriend was a mess, and I did nothing to help. I also did nothing to help when out of the cupboard in the corner of the room, someone emerged and came up behind her, grabbing her by her mouth. He brushed her face with the back of his hand, shushing her. I was frozen. She fought ferociously to free herself, but to no avail. I looked on as she cried, and she tried to scream but was silenced with a blow to the head. She was his next victim. I didn't help her. That isn't my job. I mean, he does all the dirty work. I just work the camera.